Driving for rideshare companies at night has its perks: quieter roads, better tips, and the kind of peaceful solitude that can lull you into a false sense of security. But that night, I learned just how dangerous the job could be. It was after 2 a.m. when the request came in, a pickup from a convenience store not far from my usual route. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Quiet street, short ride, nothing out of the ordinary. As I pulled up to the store, my gut twisted. The place was closed. Lights off, doors locked, and not a single car in the lot. But there he was, pacing outside in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. His hoodie was filthy, holes in the sleeves, the fabric stained with God knows what. His movements were sharp and erratic, like he couldn't sit still. Every few seconds, he'd glance over his shoulder, muttering to himself like he was expecting someone, or something, to appear. I froze. Every instinct told me to cancel the ride and drive away. My finger hovered over the cancel button, but I hesitated. Maybe he was just having a rough night. Maybe he needed help. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word, slamming the door harder than necessary. The moment I took my foot off the brake, I regretted it. Most passengers scroll through their phones or stare out the window. Not him. He just stared at me. Through the rearview mirror, his eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, his face partially obscured by the hood. His gaze was intense, sharp, like he was studying me, deciding something. I tried to ignore him, kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. After a few minutes of silence, I reached for the radio, hoping music might break the tension. The moment I turned it on, he snapped, "Turn it off." His voice was deep, raspy, the kind of voice that comes from years of heavy smoking. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. I said, "Turn it off." My pulse quickened as I twisted the knob, silencing the music. I didn't argue. I didn't look at him. I just gripped the wheel and focused on the GPS, silently counting down the minutes until the ride was over. We drove in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke again. "You ever pick up someone you shouldn't have?" The question hit me like a gut punch. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to play it off. "I hope not," I said, keeping my tone light. He didn't laugh, didn't smile. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite hear. He started rambling about how he used to be an Uber driver, how some punks had stolen from him and he quit after that. His words were slurred, disjointed, like he was half telling a story, half talking to himself. But the way he smiled, God, that smile, sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from someone reliving a bad memory. It was something else, something sinister. Then he said, "It's funny, isn't it? How much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That's when the panic set in. My grip on the wheel tightened. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to act like his words didn't bother me. But my mind was racing. Every possibility, every worst-case scenario played out in my head. The GPS said we were only a few minutes away from his destination, but it felt like hours. He kept talking, his voice low, almost a whisper now. I couldn't make out half of what he was saying, but the bits I caught were enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't mean it. "I'm a bad person. I'm sorry." I didn't respond. I didn't dare. When we were about a block from his stop, he suddenly snapped upright, his voice sharp and angry. "You missed the turn." I hadn't missed it. The GPS was clear. We were on track. But I slammed on the brakes anyway, my heart pounding. "Pull over," he demanded. I didn't argue. I guided the car to the curb, my hands shaking as I shifted into park. Before I could say anything, headlights appeared behind us. A police car creeping down the street. My heart leapt. The cruiser's spotlight swept over the car, briefly illuminating the man in the back seat. His reaction was immediate. He slouched down, sliding almost completely horizontal across the seat. His eyes were squeezed shut, his body tense like a coiled spring. I turned my head slightly, trying to see what he was doing without being obvious. When I looked back, his eyes were open, watching me. I whipped my head around, staring straight ahead. My breathing was shallow, my palms sweaty against the wheel. Finally, the police car passed, its taillights disappearing around the corner. The man sat up slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face. "You got lucky," he said. Before I could respond, he opened the door and slipped out into the night. I didn't stick around. I ended the ride, locked the doors, and drove straight home, my hands trembling the entire way. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I realized just how dangerous that night had been. I was scrolling through the news when a headline caught my eye. "Convenience store robbery suspect still at large." The store in question? 2 blocks from where I'd picked up my passenger. My stomach turned as I read the details. The robbery had occurred mere minutes before I'd arrived. To this day, I can't shake the thought of how close I came to danger, how easily things could have gone wrong. I installed a dash cam the very next day, and I've never ignored my instincts again. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a place to escape, heal, and find peace after the life I had left behind. Nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest, it was everything I needed. Isolated, quiet, a world away from the constant noise that had once been my undoing. The first week felt like heaven. I woke to birdsong instead of blaring horns. My days were filled with the scent of pine, the hum of the wind through the trees, and the comforting crackle of a fire in the stone hearth. The nights were still, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets or the occasional distant howl of a coyote. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. That peace lasted exactly 7 days. On the 8th day, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't just a polite tap. It was deliberate, slow, almost rhythmic. My heart skipped. It was rare enough to hear anyone out here, let alone have someone show up unannounced. When I opened the door, I saw her. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with long, gray hair that reached halfway down her back. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto mine immediately, and for a moment, I felt like she could see right through me. She was holding a basket of preserves, jars of jams and jellies wrapped in cloth like something out of a Hallmark movie. "Welcome to the woods," she said flatly, extending the basket toward me. I hesitated, thrown by the contrast between her kind gesture and her unervingly blunt tone. Still, I took the basket, muttering a thank you. She didn't leave. Her eyes stayed on mine, unblinking, her face expressionless. Then, after an uncomfortable silence, she spoke again. "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." Her words hung in the air like a fog. They didn't sound like friendly advice. They sounded like a warning. Before I could respond, she nodded, turned, and began walking back down the dirt path that disappeared into the forest. I stood there, basket in hand, watching until she vanished into the trees. The encounter left me rattled, but I brushed it off. People out here were bound to be a little quirky, right? I set the basket down on the counter and didn't think much more of it. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in. Thunderstorms are rare in this part of Oregon, but the sky was alive with flashes of light, the rain coming down in sheets. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, the storm's natural soundtrack oddly soothing. Until the knock came again. This time, it wasn't slow or rhythmic. It was frantic, banging, like someone was desperate to be let in. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door, peering through the small window beside it. It was her, the old woman, Michelle. She was soaked to the bone, her long hair plastered to her face, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I opened the door, and before I could speak, she blurted out, "There's someone near your woodpile." Her words hit me like a bucket of ice water. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the rain. The beam cut through the downpour, illuminating the trees, the mud, the scattered logs by the woodpile. But no one was there. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice tight. She nodded, her eyes darting back toward the woods like she expected someone, or something, to emerge. I kept scanning the area, but there was nothing to see, just rain and shadows. Before I could question her further, she turned and started walking back down the path, her flashlight bobbing in the dark. She didn't wait for a response, didn't offer any further explanation. I stood there until her light disappeared. Only then did it hit me. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile? Her cabin was a 10-minute walk through dense forest. She'd have to be standing on my property to notice anything. And why the hell would she be out here during a thunderstorm? The unease gnawed at me, but I locked up the cabin as securely as I could and tried to shake it off. The storm continued into the night, and I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound had come from just outside my bedroom window. Slowly, I crept out of bed and moved to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I peered through the glass, praying I wouldn't see anything. At first, I didn't. Then, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw her. Michelle. She was standing perfectly still, her back to me, her long, wet hair hanging limp in the moonlight. My breath caught. Why was she out there? What was she doing? I strained to see more, but the shadows obscured her face. Just as I began to take a step back, her head started to turn. I ducked beneath the window, my heart in my throat. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, crouched in the dark, listening to the storm. When I finally mustered the courage to peek again, she was gone. The next few hours were a blur of paranoia. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, a knife clutched in one hand, my flashlight in the other, waiting for something to happen. At some point, there was another knock. This one was softer, quieter, but no less terrifying. I crept to the door, peered through the window. It wasn't Michelle. It was a man, bald, burly, with a thick beard. He stood on my porch, his hand raised like he was about to knock again. Every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. I backed away, retreating to the bathroom and locking the door. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me as the banging began, louder this time, like he was throwing his entire weight against the door. Glass shattered, wood splintered. I sat there, holding my breath, listening as the man tore through my cabin. When the police arrived, he was gone. The officers searched the property but found no trace of him or Michelle. When I begged them to check her cabin, they reluctantly agreed. It was abandoned. They told me no one had lived there in decades. To this day, I don't know who or what Michelle was. A warning? A threat? All I know is that I never went back. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her words. Keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe. The drive from my house to Catherine's had become a Christmas tradition. After spending Christmas Eve with my family, we'd load up the car and drive through the quiet back roads to her parents' house. It was always late, usually after midnight, and the roads were empty except for the occasional snowplow or wandering deer. There was something magical about those drives. The snow falling softly, the world silent and still, the two of us alone in the warmth of the car with the music cranked up. It felt like the world belonged to us. But last Christmas Eve, that drive changed everything. It started like any other. The night was cold, the roads deserted, and the snow fell in gentle flurries. We packed the car, said our goodbyes, and hit the road with Juice WRLD playing on the speakers, our guilty pleasure. About 20 minutes into the drive, my phone rang. I glanced down at the screen, frowning. Unknown number. I sighed and ignored it. Scam calls were a constant nuisance, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with one. Catherine made a joke about call center workers being committed enough to work on Christmas Eve, and we laughed. The music came back on, and we thought nothing of it. Then, a few minutes later, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. I hesitated this time, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It was strange enough to get one call this late, but two? I ignored it again, brushing it off as a coincidence. Catherine raised an eyebrow at me. "That's weird," she said. I nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Probably the same scammer. The third call came 2 minutes later. I cursed under my breath and snatched up the phone, swiping to answer. "Hello?" At first, there was only silence. Then, faint static crackled through the line. I was about to hang up when a man's voice broke through. "Hello, Luke." My heart stopped. I tightened my grip on the phone, my other hand white-knuckling the steering wheel. The voice was unfamiliar, low, calm, and deliberate. "Who is this?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he began listing personal details, my full name, my address, where I worked. Things no stranger should know. My mouth went dry. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a prank? A hacker? A scammer who'd done their homework? Catherine noticed my change in demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice edged with concern. I shook my head, holding up a hand to silence her. The man paused, letting the static fill the air. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "I'm not here for you, Luke." I froze. "I'm here for Catherine." The words hit like a sledgehammer. I turned to look at her, my heart hammering in my chest. Her wide, terrified eyes told me she'd heard him. "You've got the wrong number," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know anyone named Catherine." The man chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. "She's sitting right next to you." That was it. I couldn't keep driving. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. I was about to demand answers when Catherine reached over and ended the call. "What are you doing?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "He knows who we are. He's threatening us." She didn't respond right away, her face pale, her hands shaking. "I panicked," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." I tried calling the number back, once, twice, 3 times, but it didn't go through. The line was dead. The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't turn the music back on. I didn't say a word. My mind was spinning, replaying the call over and over, trying to make sense of it. How did he know so much about us? Who the hell was he? Catherine stared out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I could tell she was scared, but part of me couldn't shake a nagging suspicion. There had been moments in our relationship, small, seemingly insignificant moments, where I'd caught her in little white lies. Nothing major, nothing worth fighting over, but enough to plant a seed of doubt. Could she have known something about this? Could she have been hiding something? I told myself I was being paranoid. When we finally pulled into her parents' driveway, neither of us spoke. She grabbed her bag, gave me a brief, strained smile, and went inside. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me. Catherine insisted she had no idea who the man was or how he knew so much about us. Our families swore up and down they hadn't told anyone about our plans that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap into my throat. Every time I got a call from an unknown number, I'd hesitate before answering, terrified of hearing that voice again. It's been almost a month now, and I still don't have answers. But I know one thing. He'll call again. It's only a matter of time.